You know that moment when someone humiliates you in front of everyone. Now, imagine that someone is your own parents, and imagine it happening at a wedding, in front of relatives, friends, strangers. Yeah, that happened to me. My name is Emily Carter, and what my parents said about me that night changed everything, not just for me, for them too, because calling me a failure in front of hundreds of people turned out to be the worst mistake of their lives. But to understand why, you need to know what happened that night. And trust me, it started like a normal wedding. My cousin Jessica was getting married. Big venue, beautiful decorations, white roses everywhere, the kind of wedding people post on Instagram. My parents were excited, not because of Jessica, but because family gatherings were their favorite place to compare their kids with others. Yeah, that was kind of their thing. And unfortunately, I was always the example of what not to become. My brother, doctor. My cousin, lawyer. Another cousin, tech startup guy making six figures. And me, I was, well, according to them, still figuring life out, which is a polite way of saying a disappointment. But here's the part they never told anyone. 2 years earlier, I left home, not because I wanted to, because I had to. My parents believed success only looked one way: college, corporate job, stable salary. But I had a different dream. I wanted to start my own business. And to them, that was the same as saying, I want to ruin my life. So when I dropped out of business school, things exploded. My dad stopped talking to me. My mom cried for weeks. And the final thing my father said before I left the house was something I will never forget. He looked straight at me and said, Emily, you're going to fail. And when you do, don't come back here. That sentence stayed in my head for 2 years. 2 very long years. Fast forward to the wedding. I almost didn't go, honestly. But my aunt insisted. Family is family, she said. So I showed up. Simple black dress. Minimal makeup. Trying to stay invisible. And, at first, everything was fine. People smiled. Some relatives asked polite questions. So, Emily, what are you doing these days? I just smiled and said, working on a project. Because explaining my life to them would take hours. But then dinner started. And that's when things went wrong. Very wrong. You see, in my family, weddings always include speeches. Parents, relatives, and unfortunately, my father. Now, usually he talks about family values, tradition, respect, the usual stuff. But that night, for some reason, he decided to talk about his children. First, he talked about my brother. Daniel is a surgeon now, he proudly said. The crowd clapped. Of course they did. Then he mentioned my cousins. More applause. And then he mentioned me. I remember the exact moment. My stomach dropped because he laughed, actually laughed. And then he said something that made the entire room turn toward me. Not all of my children turned out successful, he said. Some people chuckled awkwardly. I froze, but he didn't stop. He looked straight at me across the room and said loudly, Emily decided she didn't want an education or a real job. More laughter. My hands started shaking. And then came the sentence that changed everything. He raised his glass and said, here's to hoping she figures life out someday. Because right now, he paused, smiled, and finished the sentence. She's basically a failure. The room went silent. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others avoided eye contact. My mother? She didn't say a word. She just looked down at her plate. And that moment, something inside me changed. Because they thought I would do what I always did. Stay quiet. Smile politely. Pretend it didn't hurt. But this time, I stood up, slowly. Every eye in the room turned toward me. My father smirked, like he had already won, like I had nothing to say. But What he didn't know was that the last 2 years had changed my life in ways he could never imagine. And when I finally spoke, the entire wedding reception went completely silent because the next words out of my mouth were about to destroy the story my parents had been telling about me for years. And the worst part, they had no idea what was coming next. The room was silent. You could actually hear the air conditioner humming. Hundreds of eyes were on me. My dad still had that little smirk on his face, like he expected me to sit back down, like he thought I had nothing to say. For a second, I almost did. Old habits, years of staying quiet, years of being the disappointment. But then I remembered something. 2 years earlier, standing in the driveway with my suitcase, my dad saying, "Emily, you're going to fail." And suddenly, I wasn't nervous anymore. I picked up the microphone. My hands were steady now. I looked around the room. Family, relatives, people who had heard the same story about me for years. Emily, the quitter. Emily, the dreamer. Emily, the failure. So I took a small breath and said something nobody expected. Dad's right about one thing. The room shifted. People leaned closer. My dad nodded slightly, like he had just proven his point. But then I continued. I did leave school. A few whispers started. I kept going. And yeah, I didn't get a normal job. More whispers. But then I said the next sentence. And for the last 2 years, I've been building something. Now, the room was curious, not judgmental. Curious. My dad frowned, because this wasn't going the way he expected. I looked directly at him. Then I said quietly, "Remember when you told me not to come back after I failed?" He didn't answer. Of course he didn't. So I continued. Well, I didn't. The silence got heavier. I slept on a friend's couch for 3 months. I worked 2 part-time jobs. And every night, I worked on my idea. I could see some relatives exchanging looks now, because this was the first time anyone had heard this. My parents never asked. Not once. Then I said something that made the entire room hold their breath. Last year, that idea became a company. My dad's smile disappeared. My mom slowly looked up. People started whispering louder. Now, what company? What is she talking about? I kept my voice calm. Short sentences. Clear. The company sells custom event planning software. Ironically, for weddings. A few people laughed softly at that, but I continued. Right now, it's used by over 300 event planners. Now, the whispers turned into real reactions. Some people looked shocked, some confused. My dad looked uncomfortable. And then I said the sentence that changed everything. Last month, we sold 30% of the company to an investor. Now the room exploded in murmurs. But I wasn't done. The valuation was $10 million. Someone actually dropped a fork. My cousin's jaw literally fell open. My mom looked like she couldn't breathe. And my father, he looked like the ground had disappeared under him. I paused, just for a second. Then I finished the sentence. So, yeah, Dad was right. A few nervous laughs. Then I said it. My biggest motivation was proving him wrong. The room went dead quiet again, but something had changed. The energy. People weren't looking at me with pity anymore. They were looking with respect, some even with pride. My dad looked like he wanted to say something, but the words never came, because for the first time in my life, he had nothing, no speech, no comparison, no lecture, just silence. Then my aunt started clapping. One person, then another, then the entire room. Loud applause. People stood up. Some relatives came over to hug me. Even Jessica, the bride, was laughing and crying at the same time. And my parents, they were still sitting there, frozen. Finally, my mom stood up slowly. She walked toward me. Her eyes were red, like she had been holding tears back for a long time. She hugged me tightly and whispered something I had waited years to hear. "I'm proud of you." Just 4 words, but they felt heavy, important. Then my dad stood up. Everyone watched him, because this was the moment. Would he say something? Apologize? Admit he was wrong? He walked up to me slowly, looked at me for a long second, and then he said something very quietly, something only I could hear. "I didn't think you could do it." Not an apology, not really, but it was the closest thing I was ever going to get. And honestly, that was enough, because that night, I realized something important. Success isn't just about money or proving people wrong. Sometimes, success is simply standing up, telling your story, and refusing to let other people decide your worth. But the funny part, after the wedding, my dad introduced me to 3 relatives as my daughter, the entrepreneur. And every time he said it, I could see the embarrassment on his face, because deep down, he knew something. Calling me a failure at that wedding was the moment he lost the argument forever, and the moment I finally stopped needing his approval.